okay, now that I understood these larger ideas, my job as a historian was to bring history to this problem. You know, why did it happen then? Why did it happen in the 1950s, say, that huge numbers of white women, young white women, were subjected to this really fairly new and radical and bizarre piece of social engineering? I always caution that I'm not saying that there was no adoption. There was, you know, before the late 40s and the 1940s and 1950s. Yes, there was adoption. We all probably know somebody who's 60 who was adopted, or even 80. But these were small, relatively isolated events. There were no large adoption agencies in the way that we came to know them in the 50s and 60s. The adoption became a sort of mandate for, I mean, you know, certainly there are many, many reasons why the 1950s and 1960s were the crescendo, and why this whole experience was so successfully carried out at that time. And I can't, you know, kind of give you a full treatment of that, although I certainly recommend Wake Up Little Susie. I can just point out a few things that were, you know, really just sort of indubitably powerful aspects of why this happened then. In the 1950s, as we all know, we've, you know, sort of been conditioned to think of it as the decade of the family mandate. You know, that people, that, you know, family was all in a moment in American history after a decade of and more of economic depression, the 1930s, and then the war in the 1940s, which all of which created an enormous amount of sort of social dislocation and family disorganization. In the 1950s, after the war, I mean, there's lots to say about that, about why that happened then and the forms that it took and what was really happening. But in any case, there was certainly a very powerful cultural mandate that said that family needed to be at the center of society. And therefore, many people who in the 1930s, say, or even in the 1940s, who found themselves infertile or only able to have one child or not able to have any children, who would have just accepted that earlier, were unwilling to accept it then. And you know, it was also a period when, after the war, when so many women had gone into factories and had gone to work, there was a real big interest in creating traditional family life, which meant that women should come back into the homes, that we should traditionalize. Of course, this was historically insane, but in any case, to traditionalize the behavior, the gender roles of women. And that meant that even though more and more young women were having premarital sex, it needed to be effaced, it needed to be erased and covered up. And so when it happened, sending young women away and removing the evidence was more important than ever. And of course, one of the things that really blows my mind is the way that the definition of illegitimate pregnancy changed from the 1930s to the 1950s. In the 1930s, it was just, all of the literature associates illegitimate pregnancy with having grown up in a poor environment, being the child of alcoholic parents, having a subnormal IQ, having qualities which, and the association between environment and biology was very close in the writing of social scientists then. So this understanding that there was something that adhered to your body, really, that made you sort of a sub-performing human if you had an illegitimate pregnancy, and this belief that if you got pregnant without being married and were this poor specimen of humanity, that your child would probably be born similarly less than desirable. So there weren't lots of people, you know, sort of clamoring around to adopt these children because they were assumed to be inferior products. But when and I'm sorry for those of you who've heard me say this many times, but there's so many people who haven't that I'm going through it, and I'm almost done with this. But there were so many, in the late 1940s and early 1950s, as Freudian theory Freudian explanations, psychological explanations, Freudian tinged or reshaped theories were hitting the front lines of service delivery as social workers all over the country were beginning to rethink who was the illegitimately pregnant white girl and what was the nature of the baby that she gave birth to. And Freudian theory said the problem isn't in the body, isn't in the subnormality of this young woman, it's in her mind. She got pregnant without having a husband because she had a bad relationship with her mother, because her father had died, because her parents were divorced, that it was all a psychological problem. And if you just submit this girl to treatment, if you send her to social workers, if you get her a psychiatrist, we can make her better. And it had profound, as you can imagine, implications for the child that she gave birth to, because the child was no longer tainted as long as it was a psychological problem. The child could come out untainted, pure, and therefore a perfect commodity for the newly emergent adoption market. So that when these babies were no longer seen as tainted, but seen as pure, good quality commodities, girls who had babies without having husbands were ever more valuable conduits of these valuable commodities for middle-class parents who felt, middle-class people, let's say, who felt that they needed to get babies to achieve the middle-class ideal in post-war American society. That's why those are some of the real big reasons why this burst onto our cultural scene in the post-war period. Suddenly, all these girls who had sex and had no access to birth control were defined as psychologically disturbed, producing valuable babies. Why did it end in the form that we knew it, especially in the 1950s and 60s? Why did white girls generally stop giving up their babies for adoption? Again, there are many reasons, but I'm going to tell you one really big one, really powerful reason, and that was Roe v. Wade. And it sounds very paradoxical. How can I claim that because abortion was legalized, girls started keeping their babies? And this is it. When the law said that you can decide, young woman, whether or not to stay pregnant, then, figured many young women, if I can decide whether or not to stay pregnant, surely I can decide whether or not to be the mother of the child that's going to come out of my body. So a lot of young women, newly empowered by lots of feminist stuff that was happening in the late 60s and early 70s, but surely empowered very directly by Roe v. Wade, said, when their parents said, "You're not going to darken my doorway with the bastard child," said, "Oh, well, okay, I'll get my own apartment, but you can't tell me this isn't my baby." And so what we begin to see is this amazing unintended consequence of Roe v. Wade, which is the absolute explosion of single mother-headed households right after, starting in the early 1970s. And when that happened, you see the decline of white babies available on this struggling adoption market now. And of course, what begins to happen absolutely simultaneously with the legalization of abortion is the development of adoption markets in other countries to feed the rapacious need for babies in the United States.